Chicago, moved on to Murphy Jahn in Chicago, did some time with Ellerbe Becket where he won, put him on the map with competition to win the stadium in Saitama, which he will show today in terms of architecture that moves. It is a very, very large scale operable roof, which really, really inspired me as a student, something that I was really, really moved by, and no pun intended. And those of you from Los Angeles will probably know him best, or his work the best, as the home of the Lakers and my team, the Clippers, as well as many other stadiums around the world, and very pleased to introduce him and excited to see everything he's going to show us today.
Thanks, Alvin. For those of you who haven't done this, I will tell you there's nothing more intimidating than showing architecture to a bunch of architects. So feel free to jeer. I have a pretty healthy ego, so I can take it if you see anything too off track. I wanted to start with a little bit of history, just because I often get asked this question, that did I grow up to be a sports architect because I was a huge sports freak? It seems like a natural progression that, sorry. Oh yeah, thanks. I think the AV one is the one we decided. Yeah, that's perfect. And the fact is that that's really not true. It really had little to do with that. I am a sports fan. I mean, I tend to care about a few sports more than others. But it really was kind of an accident in some ways that I ended up in this odd little specialty. And in some ways, that's very important to the work that I ended up doing. So I'll explain that a little bit more as we go forward. This isn't the work that I did. This was kind of the state of the industry when this first came up to me. Actually, a friend of mine, Carlos Zapata, who had been working with Peter Pran at Ellerbe Becket at the time, he knew I was kind of getting tired of working on buildings. This was in the late 80s, where I was working in Murphy Jahn and a couple of other commercial architecture firms, that we were doing a lot of drawings of towers around the world that just weren't getting built. And so Carlos said, I don't know if you could handle living in Kansas City, but there are this small handful of firms that are doing all the work in the world in sports, and a lot of these buildings are getting built. And so, looking at the sort of state of the industry at the time, it seemed like the building type had been so driven around the diagram and the technology of putting seats around a particular floor or pitch, that there wasn't a lot of thought about urbanism and architecture and a lot of the things that I'd been exposed to in large-scale architecture. And there were literally dozens and dozens of these buildings going on. So when I first went into Kansas City, and as Alvin mentioned, I started in Ellerbe Becket, I walked around and there were literally, I don't know, maybe a handful, 8 or 10 kids that had all come out of K-State or KU in their early 20s that were each designing buildings worth a couple $100 million that were really important to cities. So that's what really attracted me to this. And I became a bigger sports fan afterwards. So the hard part was that I knew that there was this feeling that there really was a secret about these buildings. And so I wanted to figure out, is there a way that I wouldn't turn into just a sports architect, but could bring some of the thinking that I'd been exposed to in large-scale commercial architecture to change the building type. And so the first building, one of the first buildings I worked on was this, a competition in Korea. And because I didn't completely understand all the issues with the building type, this actually has a baseball stadium inside of it. And it was for a large Korean client. And the idea was to kind of bury the what I had seen as the sort of ugly shape of these buildings inside something I could control a little bit more like another building type. So these first few buildings here, I just wanted to show you, these were sort of early things that I was taking a shot at, trying to rethink how the building was organized. In this case, a China competition for a stadium, really looking at new ways to express the structure. It also seemed to me that these buildings were all about structure, and in lots of cases that structure was kind of getting buried in some sort of wrapping of the building. This was a very early competition for the Beijing Olympics when it was still in a sort of master plan stage, but looking at what was kind of the iconic stadium for the opening and closing ceremonies in athletics, and then the large convention center. And again, not that this is anything about great architecture, but it was me sort of kind of testing my way through this building type and trying to understand what could and couldn't be done. This was my scheme for what ultimately became the bird's nest. And again, not anywhere near as poetic as what I think Herzog and DeMeuron did with the bird's nest. But for me, it was about testing the idea of, this was the part that I was less comfortable with playing with, the basic stadium, but I had this idea of what if you lifted the roof above it and then occupied that roof and turned it into a museum and cultural things. And I'm showing you this because you'll see at the end of the lecture where this idea kind of came back around for me. But again, it was sort of testing what's possible and what's not. This was an early scheme for Madison Square Garden. And again, shows you a little bit about how, when I was still in a very conceptual stage in this building type, trying to rethink what a building like this could be. And for those of you who don't know Madison Square Garden, or the ones that have been there, the thing that's always amazed me is there's no garden. You know, I never really understood where did this name come from, because it's nothing but a bit of a concrete jungle with an office building over it. So in working with the client, what we did, similar to Staples in some ways, treated this as this bowl shape is really the arena, and then all the other stuff that goes along with these buildings, the clubs and the offices for the teams, and the sort of entertainment, retail, food and beverage opportunities, those all got placed into this big floating roof over what I guess was 6th or 7th Avenue in this scheme, but then creating this large winter garden underneath it. So the thought was everybody would get out of their taxi and walk through a real garden on their way to the arena itself. Fortunately, I didn't get stuck too long in just doing conceptual things, and one of the first projects after moving to LA that I got to work on was Staples Center. And this is one of those odd stories of where the developer called me and said, hey, I just need a sketch of something like that looks like an arena sitting next to the convention center, and I've got to go to the city in 2 hours. Can you fax me something? And so this was the very original sketch of what later became Staples Center. It's not a process I advocate, by the way. This is one of those that kind of got out of control, and by the end of that meeting, they sort of liked this idea of the shape and the round and the leaning, and it became the basis of what ultimately became, pretty much here is the scheme for Staples Center. One of the important things about Staples Center for me was that when we presented the very first scheme or at least to the level that we had some time to think about it, we built a giant model that showed all of this other stuff around the arena, because at the time there was really nothing going on downtown. And while a lot of people had sort of talked down the city as a place for a new arena, it seemed to me the issue wasn't that it was a bad place, it's just that there wasn't a lot going on there. So we pitched to the client that you shouldn't build this without thinking about this, and really think about it as an entertainment destination. And ultimately that influenced what, as most of you know now, became LA Live. And I think I've got a couple of shots of that in here. Yeah, so it really did kind of grow into, I didn't end up designing LA Live or planning it, so that ended up being another architect, but it really was part of our original thinking and has influenced a lot of my work since, that you try and pull the event outside, you look for a reason for people to come here before and after the event and really have a place to go. And hopefully, because these buildings generate so many events, Staples Center is almost 300 events a year, 4 or 5 professional teams, the number of people here should really drive urban change in at least the arena building type. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between arenas and stadiums. On the subject of stadiums, back to that part about me being a sports fan, the things I liked, the sport that I was most passionate about was the NFL. And it took me a few years in doing this before I actually got a shot at an NFL client. And the only reason we got a shot at this one anyway, I was kind of seen as the arena guy now because I was designing Staples Center at the time. And this client had already gone pretty far down the path with another architect. And I called them and just sort of begged my way into a presentation. And they said, well, if you can show us something we haven't seen before, then maybe we'll open this back up. Well, the client was the Cincinnati Bengals. And one of the problems that the Cincinnati Bengals had is that they were a pretty bad team. And so they had a lot of trouble filling the stadium. And one of the things the owner, who goes back to the beginnings of the NFL, this family, so he's been around for a long time in this industry, he said to me that we can't sell corner seats in our stadium because people don't want to sit in the corners and we can't fill the stadium, but I guess you have to build them because all the stadiums have them. Back to those diagrams I showed you at the beginning, almost every NFL stadium looked exactly the same as a diagram, but it had a different wrapping. So I said, well, no, if you can't fill the seats, you just take them out. Let's break out these corners. Now, this might not seem very innovative to you all. It seems like a pretty simple idea, but in the NFL, this was like, oh my God, I can't believe we're not building corner seats, and people are going to be able to see into the stadium and see out of the stadium. And pretty quickly, it became clear that this was actually going to be a huge advantage to them. Now, what it did to keep the capacity up, we had to push up the size of this, the sideline seating. And everybody worried about that are we pushing the seats too high now, the same number of seats by taking them out of the corners. What we found when we started selling seats, those were the first seats to sell, because people can tell their friends they're sitting on the 50-yard line. They're really high, but they're right on the 50-yard line. And they'd much rather say that than sit low in the corners. The other thing it did is where these seats did not exist anymore, we created decks, and those have turned into huge party decks that people actually who own these seats now that they were worried about don't even go to their seats. They buy these tickets and they'll come and stand in the corners and have beer with a whole bunch of other people. So the other thing it did for me is it began to expose the stadium, and this is where I started to at least understand the building type and felt a little bit more comfortable about it. So there's a lot of sort of peeling the onion layers back and exposing the structure of the stadium and finding these areas where it does open up. And for a football stadium, this was pretty groundbreaking at the time. It led to a couple of other concepts similar to that. This one for the 49ers, which a project that, I don't know, I think I've won this project 3 times, and the owner kept blowing up and project kept going away. So that one's a bit of a sensitive spot for me. Philadelphia, this one had a little bit of an overlay. Actually, the client had hired Michael Graves before we came along, and so I had to talk them out of doing a Michael Graves stadium, but couldn't quite talk them out of brick and steel, and ultimately they felt like this related a lot to Philadelphia architecture and things like that. So that was a bit of an overlay. And again, you can see that this idea of the open corners and really sort of exposing the structure in the roof, those are all really important ideas to the work that I was doing. And this gets a little bit to more about what I was going to talk about tonight. That one of the things that has been real exciting for me in this building type is because these buildings are so much about event and the sort of dynamic nature of event, and it's really important that they become flexible, that they're not completely fixed into any one single event or capacity. There's been a lot of ability to play with what they are as buildings. And so very early on, I got the opportunity to do 2 ballparks that I never would have won these projects if they didn't have retractable roofs. The addition of a retractable roof on a traditional ballpark, this kind of architecture, was seen as something that was really difficult in the industry. They couldn't imagine how could you do what was considered a space age architectural technology and put it on a retro ballpark, which retro ballpark was part of the program. When we got, at least at this stage, this was in the, I don't know, I guess early 90s, mid 90s, any new ballpark, that was a programmatic overlay, was that it looked like an old time ballpark, whether it was in context or not. So I ended up winning this project by telling the client that you could have put a roof on Ebbets Field if there had been an economic driver to do it. The technology really isn't space age. It's really sort of big trucks that push these sections of roof apart. And because we did it in a radial way with these various fan-shaped roofs nesting with each other, it fit baseball a little bit more, like the track of the baseball. The other schemes that had been out there were really these sort of big sliding roofs that went from side to side. And so this really was a place where sort of history and design came together and worked for me in a way that helped me win a project that I couldn't have won in any other way, because there were people that were better at doing ballparks. And it was also one of the first times that I got to do anything quite this scale in terms of moving something in a very different way and not static in architecture. Following right on the heels of that, we won a ballpark in Seattle it's now called Safeco Field. Different problem, because in Milwaukee it's very cold, so it really does have to be conditioned when it's closed. In Seattle, it's really like an umbrella. And because their site was right along the rail tracks, we were able to design this kind of sliding nesting umbrella that most of the time just sits out there. The roof is only there to guarantee that they don't have a rain out, so it allows the team to sell season tickets. This is a big part of their economics in knowing how many season tickets they're going to have, or particular ticket sales on a game day. So even if they never close the roof the whole season, it's still worth it for them because it guarantees that people driving won't end up missing the game. And for those of you who watched the US Open over the last week, you know how devastating that can be when it can rain on an event for a week. Just a few more. So you get a sense here, even though that big roof, and it's pretty hard to hide, I mean, it has to be up that high and that big to miss the track of a baseball. Trying to at least lighten it up with the way the steel is detailed and feel more industrial, there is this sense of it's more of something that's next to the stadium, and really this is for the most part an open ballpark. Now in Japan, I didn't have the same kind of overlay of having to be a retro ballpark because obviously they don't have that kind of history. And this was a pretty interesting project. The mayor of Hiroshima is a pretty well-known anti-nuclear activist. I mean, obviously, given his place in the city that's most famous for being one of the cities hit by an atomic bomb, he's very sensitive to trying to change that image in the city. And what he talked to me about was that the teenagers of Hiroshima, they need something that's symbolic for them to think about something in the future that's not just about the sort of negative aspects of the atomic bomb. And he asked me if the stadium could become a symbol of peace. Now, I was really worried when he suggested something that seemed so referential in how you would articulate that in a stadium. But one of the things I found when I was walking around the existing stadium that was rebuilt soon after the war was this huge and very beautiful picture of a painting of a koi pond. And the team is actually called the Hiroshima Carp, so it was kind of their mascot painting, I guess. But it really gave me this idea that a lot of the photos after the war, even color photos, were very black and white and gray, and this seemed to be a great symbol of sort of life coming back to the building. And obviously similar references in some of the other great Japanese traditions. So that really led to this idea of trying to do something like Milwaukee with this radial orientation of a roof, but a lot more contemporary than what you saw in Milwaukee. And so the idea was to sort of set the pivot offset a bit and have this much more flowing, organic shape to the building. So having that experience of moving a roof, I got to spend a lot of time with some of the world's best consultants and engineers about, it's one thing to span 350, 450 feet. It's another thing to then move that span. And so I spent a lot of time learning about what to do and not to do in terms of the trucks that move these things. But then the project that Alvin mentioned that really sort of changed my career was a competition for a building in Saitama, Japan. So I'm going to get to that a little bit. I guess this is a little bit why was I so interested in the idea of transforming buildings. And what we found is that this notion that I said before about there had been this trend back to retro ballparks over the years. This is how the ballparks used to be, and then we went to this whole world of domes and retractable domes. This span in here was really about multi-purpose. And then the new trend was teams didn't want to be multi-purpose anymore. They wanted single-purpose stadiums. And that really led to, particularly in the U.S., every team demanded their own stadium. Every ballpark, every baseball team, every football team, and arenas too, to a different extent. But clearly with football and baseball, they didn't want to share facilities anymore. Partly it was driven by didn't want to share revenues, but largely because the games really don't complement each other very much. And then internationally, you had buildings like this very often, beautiful symbolic building for the Olympics that meant a lot to Beijing during that period. But then after the Olympics, they're very difficult to utilize because they're organized along an athletics track or a very large capacity, and so it's very hard to make them multi-purpose. And so what you end up with are white elephants, obviously. in this country, this is something to think about. The average cost of an NFL stadium in today's dollars over the last couple of years has been $1 billion or plus. Number of events for those same buildings is outrageously small. Now again, Staples Center can have 300 events a year. A baseball stadium can have about 60 events a year because of the season. But a football stadium, other than a concert here and there, is about 14 events per year. And at the cost of $1 billion, you can imagine how difficult that is to make the numbers pencil. So why not change it into something that's a little more transformable? And this is something that I had been thinking about for a while. Could we turn it into more of the Swiss Army knife than, just the sort of one-trick pony? And how do we do that? The technology had been in the 60s and 70s were what I call the donut stadiums. And what you can see is that if it's in a football orientation, you still have the round shape of the larger donut, and you have seats that fill in on the sides. And basically, those seats can slide to one side or another. I think I have another image of that. So same stadium, just pushing these seats around. Sometimes it was automated, but usually in this era, it was really just bringing in a truck and sort of pushing it around to get to the different configuration. Now, while it seemed like it made a lot of sense at the time, these seats all of a sudden are very far away from the football orientation. They're not great for baseball or football. So even though this became a huge wave in the 70s and seemed like a good idea at the time, like a lot of other good ideas at the time, it didn't last very long. And we kind of figured out pretty quickly that that wasn't the answer, and this is what happened to dozens of those donut stadiums over the period of the 80s and 90s. And again, a lot of it driven by the teams who said, no, I don't want any compromise. Some of it because they just wanted to have their own stadium and control their own revenues. So the question was, could you do it in another way? Could you really turn it into a transformer that became something other than, or when it's in one configuration, it's not even clear how it is the other configuration. And that leads to the project that Alvin mentioned, a competition that I won, I guess around 2000 in Japan. And the client came to us and said, we want a soccer stadium for $30,000, but it was going to be really expensive to build. It was between the local rail tracks and the high-speed bullet train. And so we suggested maybe they should build an arena, and then they came back and said, well, we want both. And so looking at the site, there was this kind of notion about you have this building that's right in between these fast-moving trains. The building itself should feel like it's fast. We started talking about the idea of an arena that could change into a football stadium, and this was sort of my first sketch of that from this idea of the sort of fast-leaning building. But what if these seats actually moved so that this is the arena and then those seats moved back and became a football stadium? At the time, I didn't even know if it was possible, but it was really kind of the idea of thinking differently about could we change it from one thing to another. And then this shows you really how the diagram of how the building got built. Here you have a 20,000 seat arena. These 10,000 seats actually move back and engage this section, and then seats and private boxes fill in on the side. So it goes from a 20,000 seat indoor arena to a 30,000 seat indoor soccer stadium. This is the moving section that just kind of rolls back. In this competition that included Jean Nouvel and Cesar Pelli and Foster and Rem Koolhaas, there were so many different ideas about how to do this. In some ways, I feel like I won because I had the dumbest idea. But I really thought that the only way it was going to get built is if it was simple and easy to pull off. Now, in reality, it took a whole bunch of Japanese engineers to figure out stuff that I don't know this could have ever happened in the U.S. at the time. But they looked at technology like refueling technology and the way connections on tarmacs are made to airplanes and folding buildings, and it's really amazing. A lot of this sort of happened, and I got to sort of sit and watch it. Like, this is an example of all the plumbing connections in the 10,000 seat block, unplug, slide back 70 meters and plug back in to incredible minute tolerances, and so a lot of the technology of how to do it was invented for this building in terms of the connections and the mechanical and plumbing connections. Here's a look at what these trucks look like that move the seats. This shows you that when you change from an arena to a stadium, it changes the sight lines, obviously, because the pitch or the floor of a basketball stadium is much smaller than a football stadium, so the seats themselves have to adjust to give you a different sight line. So that gives you a little idea. That was my first sort of exposure to something that could really change that in that kind of way. This is the back of the 10,000 seat moving block. So when it's in the arena configuration, we actually have an extra venue, and they will have volleyball matches and tournaments and things in here at the same time that they have a basketball game in the arena configuration. That's showing it in the arena configuration, and there it is in the stadium configuration for soccer. I guess there's a couple just blow-ups of that. Yeah. So you can see here that this is the seat, this is the block that moves. This whole thing slides back, and I've only seen it once happen while I was there and got to see it from underneath. One of the problems is that while it's moving, they have to shut off all the fire suppression systems. So by law, no one can be in the building except for the operators. But it only takes about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes to move it. It's pretty amazing. Now, thinking about this, we've had some other opportunities to just think out of the box about moving buildings. This is a very quick, off-the-cuff concept of a hotel room, and the brief was to rethink the idea of resort. And the idea here is that these little pod rooms actually would come out of the building on a crane and get dropped into the water. So the room and the terrace becomes your own little mini yacht, and then at the end of the day you can sort of go around and explore the islands, and then you go back and get lifted by the crane and sort of plugged back into the building. So now showing somebody like this, they'll think you're crazy at the beginning, but then I can show them Saitama stuff and it doesn't seem so crazy anymore. Back to the stadium idea, we're working on a project right now for UNLV. I won't spend a lot of time on this because it's very similar to Saitama, just the idea that once again you kind of have a moving block. They have different issues here. UNLV is trying to get a new arena and a new football stadium, and so the idea is to create a sort of indoor building that is a multi-purpose event center that has all kinds of different configurations. And Vegas is one of those few places where there's so many events that they could drive out of UNLV that could make this kind of investment in a more expensive building that's very multi-purpose worth it. That gives you a little idea about how the seats move and adjust. This idea relies pretty heavily on having fairly similar capacities between the arena and the stadium. I mean, it's one thing to go from 20,000 to 30,000. It's very hard to go from 20,000 to 60,000 or 70,000 because you're moving a lot more seats. This was, again, not a stadium, but a car club. I'll get to something that shows where it is better. But the brief here was, this is in Bahrain. And there's a causeway from Bahrain to Saudi Arabia, and the idea was that wealthy Saudis who have Ferraris and Lamborghinis, they have nowhere to store them or to have them worked on. And so the idea was to create a high-profile car club where they would have mechanics here flown in from Italy that would stay in this building, and the Saudis can store their cars there, and they can actually take them out and drive them on. You saw the image at the beginning here of the Bahrain Formula One circuit. And so the notion was to create this kind of core building that was the private club for the individuals, and then have the cars on turntables that would sort of turn around and become the way that people would get at their various cars. So you order your car up, and the mechanic puts it into the little slot, and it turns around and comes to your level. Again, kind of a crazy idea, but with the sort of investment in the region and the sort of passion about cars, it was definitely something that wasn't out of the realm of possibility there. On a much lesser, simpler scale maybe, looking at a building right now, this is a very current project of looking at the way video is done on buildings. This is a property that's just south of Times Square on Broadway and 34th. But the idea that the video on the building can move and really change the impression that instead of a sign on the building becomes the sign. And then in addition to that, we've added an urban stage, basically, by carving out a corner of the building. I think that's in here, that shows how the building could actually open up, with the suggestion that maybe it becomes an Apple store and that becomes the Apple Store stage. As you'll see here, becomes a little urban event space, creating a little mini Times Square a little bit south of the real Times Square. And then I think this is the last project, but this sort of takes everything that I've just shown you and puts it together in one project. I competed with Norman Foster and Zaha in Qatar about 1.5 years ago for Qatar's World Cup. And even though the World Cup's off to 2022, Qatar is very interested in being way ahead of everybody between now and 2022 in terms of the kind of building that they would build. And this one has pieces of Saitama, pieces of the building that I showed you in China. You sort of see the stadium underneath. The idea was to, well, I think it's actually shown better here. Typically, in a World Cup stadium in the desert, you'd build a big dome and you'd have all kinds of things around that stadium to satisfy the World Cup requirements. They're very intensive hospitality, media, security. There are all kinds of little buildings that have to go around the stadium that don't have to be there after the World Cup. So because there was a big concern about the heat and the direct sun in Qatar, the notion was, what if we took all that stuff and lifted it up in the roof, similar to what you saw in the idea for Madison Square Garden and that early Beijing scheme. So the idea of it is retractable, but it's really an occupied roof. So it's kind of like building a big building up in the air that just happens to have a stadium underneath it. One of the other ideas about this sort of flexibility and moving and reconfiguring that I was really interested in was the only real history in Qatar of architecture was the Bedouin tent. And these tents are very flexible in terms of it's about as simple technology in building as you can have, but it's very protective against the really extreme temperatures in Qatar and the wind and the dust. And they're also flexible in terms of, if you have a big group, you make a bigger tent. If you need to shrink it, you shrink it. If you need to pick it up and move somewhere else, you move somewhere else. So I thought it was a really interesting metaphor, along with the kind of urban planning and these tight gridded sites that are urban plans that we saw in cities in the Middle East. So this was one of the early diagrams. What if we started with that World Cup pitch, but made a building that could transform itself? And the thought was, because we knew there wasn't much of a budgetary constraint here, what if we did a stadium that was unlike any that had ever been done, and it could be lots of things. And besides having this roof occupied with museums, and we have a retail mall that actually steps up into the roof, and a lot of other uses, these towers that you see, one of them is a hotel, one of them is an office building, and one of them was a large media security center that's helping to support that roof. And the thought was that in this case, you're not just reconfiguring for different kinds of events. Possibly we could take this one seating block and move it all the way out of the stadium, and so you'd get basically a separate theater that, again, is sort of sitting under this giant roof. I think there's a couple of images that might illustrate that a little bit better, showing a lot of the different technology about how you do it. This is an image of what it looks like at the top of the hotel tower. And then in this view, this is similar to that image I showed you of Saitama, where this is that big moving seating block. When it's in the World Cup configuration, that piece sits up front, and this is just one large urban plaza. Again, one of the big problems in Qatar is you have all kinds of events and fan experiences that you can't put a roof over the whole country, is what people joke about a lot. You can cool a stadium, you can put a roof over it, but you can't cool the rest of the city. And in our case, we're actually covering quite a bit of the city through this really large roof, and then this retail mall that I mentioned earlier. This steps up into the roof itself. This shows the little theater piece that comes out over a large water feature. So the idea is that maybe this building gets used 100 times a year, because it's much easier to do a 10,000 seat concert than it is to do a 90,000 seat soccer match. shows you a little bit the retractable roof. We pitched the idea that one of the great things about this reconfiguration is it could be thought of as something that's not even anywhere near what people think of as a stadium. With the seats pulled way out and that theater piece pulled out, we can flood the stadium and create water course to the size that you could actually have boat racing and things like that, which obviously makes the stadium much more flexible in terms of the amount of uses and things. Give you a little sense of what that big roof looks like. And this is approaching it, sort of the main entrance, again showing that's the moving block and that's the stepping up into the retail piece. This project is, probably developed to schematic level, and the real work on the project is supposed to start in November, in hopes of being ready in 2017. And I just threw this in at the end. One of the things we heard back when we first submitted the scheme was that the prince who was in charge of organizing the World Cup he's a 23-year-old, incredibly articulate and educated guy, and he said, I really love the idea. I love the big flexibility idea. I'm just not sure if it's iconic enough. And I wasn't exactly sure what that meant, but we thought we'd try and pitch it this way by proving that if he would build this stadium, we could get it on the cover of Time magazine. So that was really ultimately our big sales pitch. And I think, that's the end of it. The sort of fortunate and unfortunate thing for me is that the original price when it was at 90,000 seats came in at about $2.6 billion. And a reporter got a hold of it recently and has been calling it the world's most expensive stadium ever built, which of course you don't want your client to hear that that's what we've just given them. But the great thing, very passionate client, and they want to do something that shows that Qatar really deserves winning the World Cup against long odds. And they see their investment in architecture as a way of doing that. So it's pretty exciting. That's it. Thanks.
So we have a little time for questions.
It's kind of like my studio class. My studio class should be asking questions, however.
Well, I'm not in your studio.
Yeah, it's all right.
I'm not an architect either. But I have been following all the discussion about putting an NFL stadium in downtown Los Angeles. And I was wondering what some of your thoughts were about putting a stadium there and creating this stadium that's for football and that's supposed to serve the convention as well.
Yeah, it puts me in a really tough spot because, as you know, well, I don't know, you may not know, but most of you know here that I'm working on the competing stadium to downtown. And my firm's working on the convention center site too, so I'm pretty much off the record about the downtown stadium. So, yeah. In general, I can speak about it that way. One of the things that often gets mixed up is that a football stadium, again, it only has a few events a year, so it's not the same kind of driver that a baseball stadium or an arena has for downtown. And I think the big question, obviously there's a big investment in downtown in terms of an entertainment destination, and it's working really well. And so the question is the additional investment and additional events that a football stadium will bring to it. There are pros and cons to that, obviously. As opposed to the project that I worked on, which is out of the central city and a little bit more like the earlier versions of football stadiums tended to be more suburban because they relied really heavily on a lot of parking, tailgating. So I think the debate in LA is an interesting one because they're very different projects. In our project, we sort of sunk the building into the hill. We were able to take about $400 million out of the budget by building a lot of the structure into the hill. And we don't have to put a roof on it. We can be outdoors like Southern California football, seemed to me. But it's not downtown LA, right next to this amazing LA Live thing. So in a lot of people's minds, it seems like it's not in LA, it's somewhere else. And so I get the debate, but officially I'm not participating in it, if that makes sense.
I have two questions. First is technical, which is how do you protect the precise machinery of Saitama against even minor sizing activity? And the second is more sociological, which is that it seems like sports is one of the few areas in our nation where a lot of people from diverse backgrounds come together. And can an architect
Yeah. So I'll come back to that one. The first question was that fortunately I didn't have to figure that out. There were, any of you who've ever worked in Japan, I mean, the quality of the architects and the engineering there is so precise that there never seemed to be any worry, would it work? And clearly they're very sensitive, even before the tsunami and the things they've gone through recently, to earthquakes because they live with them pretty often. And so it did seem to me like what an amazing challenge. It's one thing to make a building stand up against the kind of earthquakes they have. It's another thing to make it able to move. And we witnessed how these connections literally just sort of slide into these stainless steel sleeves. And all I can tell you is that it works. I mean, they haven't had any problems with it. So
But how is it protected against?
just a lot of super brace structure and flexible connections when possible, and things like that. So now to the other point, what's interesting is one of the reasons I joined Populous was because of the name change. And originally, the funny thing is I thought it was crazy because Populous, for those of you who don't know, used to be HOK Sport. And in the world of sports architecture, in fact, I would say in the profession of architecture, there'd never been a firm in any building type that dominated one particular market as well as these guys did. And again, these are not insignificant projects, just dozens of multi-$100-million projects. And so when I heard that they were dropping that brand to become Populous, at first I thought it was really crazy, a bit like New Coke. And but then the more I thought about it, this idea of Populous was about bringing people together, and that's the really unusual thing about sports, and the thing that's always really excited me about this building type. And I explain it a lot to clients that I could design the world's tallest building, and a lot of people would recognize it, and relatively high number of people may see it, but very few people really experience it. With a stadium, I can talk to the cab driver or the wealthiest lawyer in town, and they think it's their building. It's the home of their team, and there's an embracing of it, not just as a place to gather with other people, but a real ownership of it that's really an unusual part of this building type. And I think it gets forgotten sometimes, and one of the things that I think really the industry suffered from was that there were only a handful of architects doing it. And so while they recognized that they were drawing people together, I think most of the work, as you saw at the early slides, was really driven more about, well, we just need to solve how do you put the seats around the thing, and then let's wrap it in something. So it's only been really recently that I think the firms, the smart ones, have really thought about, it's not about the building anymore. We're not designing a building. That part's easy. Any architect could do it, even though they didn't want to admit that for years. What's really unusual is designing an experience. How do you bring people together? You want them to be there. You want them to hang out longer. You want them to feel what the famous survey about Disney is, that families will come out and they'll say, I spent a lot more than I thought I was going to, but it was worth every penny. If you can get that, out of your building, then that's really a great thing. And these buildings ultimately, I mean, not to put it too crassly, but they are cash registers. I mean, it's an experience, no doubt, but everybody is trying to make more money off of every square inch of that building than probably, I would say, in more than any other building, it's driven around that. And maybe to kind of come back to what I said at the very beginning, I always felt like my success in sports design was that I hadn't done it before. And I was up against guys who had done it 100 times. Now, that didn't work with every client. It didn't work with the clients like a city who was going to publicly fund a building. They wanted the guys who had done it 100 times. But the private clients who it was going to be their building, and they were putting $300 million of their own money in, which happens quite a bit, believe it or not. They wanted something new and something different, and they wanted to know that their building was as interesting as a W Hotel or a Jean Nouvel Tower, and they didn't want to just compare themselves to another stadium. So I've often talked to my partners, and certainly I sell it when I talk to clients, that the difficult thing about being an expert is at some point it makes it very difficult to innovate because you've done it so many times, and why would you change it? Because you know what works. And so to get true innovation in any building type, you need new blood, new thinking, and so I often try and push myself away from it so I don't get caught in my own, I've done it a bunch of times. It's a hard thing.
What are the cost implications in terms of extra costs for building these move-in stadiums? Because it does make so much sense originally economically to build one stadium that serves more events, but it's been done so few times, maybe because the technology wasn't there or it's so expensive?
Yeah, it's kind of both of those things. I mean, the technology of the 60s, 70s stadiums, obviously it was economical. You were really getting two stadiums for one. But in something like Saitama cost $750 million in 2000 or 99. And it was publicly funded, so they weren't too worried about whether it would make money. Now you look at Cowboys Stadium, that it has a retractable roof, but it's not really a difficult retractable roof, and it was $1.3 billion or $1.4 billion for lots of other reasons than the technology. The big question with UNLV was, could you really do this technology in the U.S. and make it economically viable? In Japan, it made sense. Not only was it publicly funded, but land there is very expensive. So if you're putting, only using one site, you're saving a lot of money. Here, that is a bigger challenge. And the clients that I've talked to in the U.S., there are two concerns. One, could it be built in the U.S.? Because what we were just talking about, the sort of precision that it takes to make it work is important. And then to make it economically viable. I'm kind of a believer that it takes 2 or 3 people to do it, to bring the cost of the technology down. I know when I first was working on a retractable roof ballpark for Milwaukee, actually it was before Milwaukee. I was with Ellerbe Becket when they did the Bank One ballpark in Phoenix. And before that project came along, the general feeling was that you couldn't afford to build a retractable roof because the Sky Dome cost $500 million. Well, you're never going to pay for a $500 million ballpark. But it occurred to me that it's like anything else. It's like Formula One technology. It's really expensive in the Formula One car, but pretty soon that stuff starts to show up in a Mercedes or a Ferrari, and little by little, if it's spread around enough and enough people do it, then the sort of fear of the technology goes down and the cost goes down. The problem in this country is that there are not enough drivers to make it happen. So for me, I think it's going to be places like Qatar, China maybe, places where they'll take some risk and it'll force, so Saitama won't be such a one-off. There'll be 3 or 4 examples, and there'll be more people that get into it, and all of a sudden the cost of the technology will come down.
Slightly off the topic of the work itself, but in terms of you discussing the fact that you've probably worked at all of those 5 firms almost.
Almost.
Yeah, those, the NBBJs, the Ellerbe Beckets, the Populuses. But now, and you saw it in your presentation, you're competing with Norman Foster and Zaha and Herzog & Miron. And what do you see as the shift that has suddenly made it a distinction from competing against these specialist service firms or firms or experts to ones that are, like with Herzog,
Right.
now has some experience.
Right.
With the typology at all.
Right. A lot of it's because the market became far more global. For 30 years, it was driven around the leagues, and America was really the only place that was building $100 million, $200 million stadiums, arenas, just one after another. And so that's why all these experts were pretty fat and happy in the U.S. When that market started to become saturated over the last few years, it also coincided with partly because internationally, typically like anything else, if you go back to the 80s, China, the Middle East, they were all looking for American expertise in design in general. So we as architects were already going worldwide, as were European architects. Sports just caught up with it. And so you have every 4 years a World Cup or an Olympic Games, there are these big international things. Internationally, most countries don't look at specialization in architecture as a necessity. They want design. And the smart architects, the design architects, figured out that the technology really was the commodity. That's how the American firms protected their cabal for so long, is that they made it seem like, oh, it's a big secret. You could never figure it out, or we've spent 20 years figuring it out. In reality, the design firms figured out, well, you give me a bowl and I'll give you a better idea. So the competition model changed a lot. And to be honest, it's been hard on the American firms because they haven't figured out how to adjust to that very well. It's one of the reasons that I think Populous was interested in me coming to them, because I had competed with them for a long time and won on those projects that really cared about design. And so What we're trying to do now is bringing together both the value of their experience in their portfolio, but helping them think out of the box so that they can compete with a Norman Foster or Zaha in design. But it's really, turning their model upside down.
I have questions that I want to ask too, but well, actually, let me ask just one, and then we can go outside and gather around the food and ask some more questions personally. It's kind of a conceptual question in a way. I don't know if it's to you, but it's to your observations of other firms as well. This, you described these buildings as a cash register, which we certainly understand, and you described it as a melting pot in a way, where people come together. And it's certainly an event, but I always, of course, come back to environmental issues. And I wonder whether or not there's even a place for environmental issues in this scale of building, in this kind of building. Do you consider that? Is that considered? I mean, if nothing else, the location of the building and the transit to and from the building, or that kind of link into it. But are environmental issues in it?
Yeah, and I'm not proud of this fact, but I've been pretty aware of it for a few years that, like I said a while ago, that it may be maybe the building type that more than any relies on making money. It's probably the last building in terms of sustainable. I mean, you can't build $1 billion worth of construction that you use 14 times a year and call it sustainable, no matter how many solar panels you put on it, right? So, the term that rings in my ears is that the most sustainable thing you can do is not build it. And so it's only been the last couple of years where clients have now, we've started to see arenas and a couple of new ballparks really thinking about getting LEED certification and things like that. But I've always been more interested in, can you really make it sustainable? Can you make it, and that's one of the things that transformable thing starts to address. If you can use it a lot more times, that makes a difference.
I like that.
Yeah.
I buy that.
And with the football stadium, that's one of the big differences between our stadium in City of Industry in downtown. One of the big ideas there was if you don't build a lot of it by putting we've been able to take 40% of the steel out of the building. So you can imagine the difference in sustainability where you don't have to mine the ore, you don't have to create the steel, you don't have to ship the steel, you don't have to construct it, you don't have to tear it down later. That's a much more sustainable idea. And on the scale of things you can do in terms of, looking at how you're treating the water usage and solar and all those other things, taking 40% of the steel out is, exponentially closer to sustainability. But it is one of the biggest challenges of these buildings, without a doubt.
Well, thank you. And those of you who want to talk, we have something to eat outside. Please stick around. And thank you again, Dan.
Thank you.
Didn't want to exactly
No,
put you
no,
on the
no, no,
spot.
no.